Welcome back to Crimes from the Peanut Gallery. We're in a little bit of a new location. You guys normally see this in the background of my podcast. So this is my little reading nook. So this is my awesome bookshelf that rotates around, which is really, really cool when I want to find something new. Bit of a Sarah J. Maas fan and a bit of a Rebecca Yayos fan. This is the trilogy, but I do have more than one of each because there's bonus copies. Now, we've obviously got here my Snoopy collection with my Care Bears and obviously my Snoopy in the background. I have always wanted to do my podcast from a chair, so this is actually really, really good for me. I really wanted to see what it was like and see what you guys thought. We are approaching the end of our mini-series, so I have posted in the community posts on YouTube that if there's anything else you guys are interested in, pop me a comment in there. Tell me what else you want to see. I'm going back to my serial killers because obviously I've got to finish all those states in the USA. So don't think that I've stopped doing serial killers. Today you are going to see probably more than anything, you're going to see the kitty cats and the dogs go in and out of frame. My little Maggie dog is outside because she's really distracting at the moment. She's wanting to go in and out. She's not really sure where she wants to be. But I just want to say welcome to anyone. And so welcome back, my fellow peanuts, and a warm welcome to anyone who's new to my podcast. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be graphic or violent content, so listener and viewer discretion is advised. So we are coming to the end of my mini-series. This is episode 5, and in today's episode, I'm going to be delving into the cold cases such as the Zodiac Killer and the Golden State Killer. So what I wanted to talk about is how the modern forensic is breathing some new life into some of those old investigations. One of the biggest ones, obviously, that's unsolved is the Zodiac Killer, and one of the most recent solved ones is the Golden State Killer. So I thought I'd give like both ends of the spectrum and give us a little bit of a versatility and see what we can find out. Now we're going to start with the Zodiac Killer. Now the Zodiac Killer, he's one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. The killer operated in the Northern California in the late 1960s to the 1970s. He would taunt the police. He would send cryptic letters and ciphers to the media. Now, despite massive and extensive investigations, the identity of the Zodiac still remains unknown. However, given all the recent advancements in forensic science, including DNA analysis, digital technology, they're providing new leads and renewed hope for solving the case. So we're going to begin with probably his look. We'll start with the history. Let's go with that first. So in the late 1960s, Northern California was gripped by fear. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, targeting unsuspecting victims and leaving behind a massive trail of terror. But what set him apart from everybody else, it's not just the brutality of his crimes, it's his psychological warfare that followed. So he's got it on the media, he's got it on the police, he's got it on the victims. He didn't just kill, he communicated with the media, he communicated to the police through letters he would send to the newspapers. He taunted investigators, he claimed responsibility for attacks, he's issuing threats against school children. These aren't ordinary letters, though. They're full of like cryptic ciphers, strange symbols, and some really chilling boasting about his killings in themselves. So they were signed with a crosshair-like symbol that became obviously his most infamous calling card. The public at the same time was captivated, but it was horrified. So who is this person and why did he crave so much attention? And how could someone commit such heinous crimes and then just vanish without a trace? The Zodiac Killer quickly became a really well-known and household name, but not just in California, not just across the United States, it's across the world. So he's inspired books, films, endless speculation. Despite decades of investigation, he still remains unknown. Now, this isn't just a story about murder, though. It's a story of obsession, mystery, and the limitations of justice. And it all began with a single terrifying message. So the killer's reign of terror began in December in 1968 with the brutal murder of teenagers Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday. It's near Valley Ho in California. They were shot while parked on a quiet road. And this seemingly random act of violence, it would be linked to a much, much larger pattern of what the Zodiac creates. Just over 6 months later, in July 1969, another couple, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Magoo, were attacked in a very similar fashion. This time, the killer actually called police and reported the crime. He would give some pretty chilling details, but he would claim responsibility. It's clear this is no sort of ordinary murderer at this stage. This is someone who wants to be well known. Now, this is not the first time we've sort of seen this thing, guys, on my podcast. A lot of these serial killers, they've got that narcissistic component to their murders. They want to be known. They want to have their voice out there. They want to have the nickname. They want to have that moniker of, we are instilling fear upon like our victims and our potential victims. After all of this, though, then comes the letters. The Zodiac begins sending cryptic messages to newspapers. He's demanding that they publish them or he's going to strike again. These letters included ciphers. Everybody knows about them. Everybody's heard about them. Some of them, though, still remain unsolved even to this day. One of the most famous, the 408 symbol cipher, was cracked by amateur code breakers and revealed a disturbing message about killing being so much fun. In September 1969, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were attacked near a lake. The killer wore a really bizarre costume, though. He wore a black hood with a white crosshair symbol and tied the couple up before stabbing them. He then drew his symbol on their car and called the police again. Just 2 weeks later, in October, a cab driver by the name of Paul Stein was shot in San Francisco. This time, the Zodiac took a piece of the victim's shirt and mailed it to the press as proof. The murder definitely it marked a shift in his pattern. He's now targeting individuals in urban settings. Over the next few years, the Zodiac continued to send letters claiming responsibility of up to 37 murders, though only 5 have now officially been confirmed. His final letter is sent in 1974, in which he's seen to vanish. Now, I've got to say, there are some parts of me, serial killers never just vanish, right? There's never a time where they just decide and wake up one morning and they're done killing. It's almost either, for me, the Zodiac has either died or he's gone to prison. There's some component that has not allowed him to continue killing. Because let's be clear, he really enjoyed it. He enjoyed the thrill. Now, maybe he became disabled in some way and he's no longer able to have those outlets and all that kind of stuff. But it's just, to me, seems very strange that the Zodiac Killer was so intent on contacting the media. He was really wanting to be out there. But suddenly he would wake up one morning and go, no, I'm done. It doesn't make any sense to me. There are so many documentaries too. The documentaries on the speculation on who it is. I watched a really good one recently and I just, for the life of me, cannot remember what it was called. But it was the speculation of basically that her stepfather had done it. Or her mum's boyfriend. I can't quite remember the story itself, but I'll definitely put a little bit more context in here. But it's just, there are some really compelling documentaries that make me go, oh, you could totally be the killer. But again, you're never really going to know, right? Like, it's one of those things that is really unknown. Now, despite the passage of time, the Zodiac's timeline remains one of the most studied and debated in criminal history. Each event added a new layer of fear, confusion, and definitely a level of fascination, right? With every new clue came more questions and answers. His attacks were calculated, but they were varied, making it difficult for investigators to establish a consistent pattern. He targeted couples parked in remote areas like Son of Sam. He would also do lone individuals in urban settings and even threatened mass violence against school children. So each crime scene was different, yet it all bore sort of the same same signature of someone who wanted to be feared, and he wanted to be remembered. One of the most disturbing aspects of his modus, his MO, was that he used ciphers and coded messages. He's obviously an extremely intelligent individual. These weren't random scribbles, right? So they're actually very constructed puzzles, some of which took years to decode. One cipher, cracked only recently, revealed a message that mocked the authorities and denied fear of capture. So others remain unsolved, leaving sort of a trail of mystery and frustration. They are still trying to decipher some of them to this day. He would use symbolism to create a brand of fear, though. His crosshair-like insignia became synonymous with fear. He signed his letters with it, he carved victims' belongings into it, and even wore it during an attack. In one case, he donned a black executioner-style hood with a symbol on his chest. Now, that was turning a brutal stabbing into almost like a theatrical performance. He wanted to communicate his crimes. Again, guys, BTK did this, right? We talked about BTK on my last episode. He loved it. He got a thrill out of it. He phoned so the Zodiac phoned police after attacks. He mailed pieces of the victim's clothing. He demanded those letters be published in newspapers and mocked them and said he was going to create more violence if they didn't. The need for attention and control made him not just a killer, but he's really a public menace because he's creating that fear and that whole he got off on that. And yet, despite some of his boldness, he was never actually caught in the act. He vanished into the night after each attack and was leaving behind some confusion, fear, and a growing legend. His ability to manipulate the media, toy with law enforcement, and disappear without a trace made him one of the most elusive criminals in history. Now, the Zodiac's MO wasn't just about how he killed, though. It's about how he terrified, how he taunted, how he thrived on the chaos that he had created. Despite the Zodiac's killer's brazen behavior, calling the police, sending letters, and even leaving behind physical evidence, he's never caught. And the fact alone has haunted investigators, journalists, amateur sleuths like myself for over a century. There's podcasts on podcasts of him, right? Apparently, they almost got him, I believe. They were really close to capturing him at some point. But one of the biggest challenges that the law enforcement community has endured is there was a lack of consistency. The Zodiac's victims, he had no victimology. It varied in age, gender, and location. His methods changed from shootings to stabbings, and his motives are never clearly defined. He just enjoyed killing, is my understanding. Now, these made it really impossible to create a criminal profile and predict his next move. There's also some jurisdictional confusion. Again, we've seen this before on other podcasts. He operated across multiple counties in California. Each of them had their own police department. And in the 1960s and 70s, law enforcement agencies didn't really share information as seamlessly as they do today. So critical evidence, leads, and suspects lists were often soiled, slowing down the investigation and allowing the killer to slip through the cracks. I don't know if it was I definitely don't think it was a fault on on police at all in this, because the media frenzy added another component and layer of complexity. The Zodiac fed off attention. Newspapers were eager to publish his letters. Whilst they may have kept the public informed, it also created almost like a circus-like atmosphere that muddied those waters slightly. So false leads, some hoaxes, and public panic overwhelmed investigators. So it diverted those resources and focus. Suspects came and went. The most well-known was Arthur Lee Allen. He's a man, so his background and behavior definitely raised red flags, but despite a lot of circumstantial evidence, DNA and handwriting analysis failed to conclusively link him to those crimes. Now, other suspects have emerged over the years, but none of them could definitively be tied to the Zodiac. So technology at the time was also a limiting factor. DNA testing was decades away. Forensic science was still sort of in its infancy. Fingerprints, blood samples, and other physical evidence were collected, but often degraded and incomplete or inconclusive. So perhaps one of the most frustrating parts of this all is the Zodiac really enjoyed the chase. He manipulated the narrative, he played games with investigators, and he disappeared as suddenly as he arrived. His final confirmation letter was sent in 1974. After that, there's been just absolute silence. It still remains unsolved to this day. And it's not because there's a lack of effort. It's just this sheer complexity of this criminal and the cunning of him. It's a case that's going to continue to challenge even the most seasoned of investigators. For decades, though, the Zodiac Killer case seems like it's frozen in time. It's an unsolvable mystery buried beneath layers of fears, speculation, and frustration. But in the most recent years, the tide's begun to turn a little bit, thanks to some remarkable advancements in forensic science and digital technology. The investigators are now actually revisiting cold cases with tools that they weren't available in the 1970s. So one of the most powerful breakthroughs has been the use of genetic genealogy. Now, this technique helped identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, which is what we're just about to talk about. And that involved, so what that involves is tracing DNA through public ancestry databases to find familial matches. Now, while the Zodiac's DNA profile is incomplete, even partial samples could lead to at least a match, especially the more databases that are growing and as technology improves. Another major development is decoding his ciphers. In 2020, a team of amateur codebreakers cracked the infamous 340-character cipher that was sent in 1969. The message didn't reveal the killer's identity, but it confirmed just sort of his mindset and reinforced the authenticity of his communications. It also proved that with persistence and collaboration, even the most complex puzzles can be solved. So I think over the next coming years, we are going to see many more developments in the Zodiac. And even if it's to understand those ciphers, right? Digital forensics are also starting to play a role. Old evidence is being reanalyzed using modern software. Handwriting analysis has become more sophisticated. Investigators, they're using AI to compare writing samples, voice recordings, and behavioral patterns across decades of data. Crowdsourcing has has added a new dimension. Online communities of amateur sleuths have pulled resources. They're sharing theories and uncovering overlooked details. Whilst not all leads are credible, the collective effort has kept the case alive and brought fresh perspectives to long-standing questions. Even law enforcement agencies have renewed their efforts. The FBI, local police departments, and private labs continue to test evidence. They re-examine suspects and they explore new angles every day. The hope is obviously that one day a single breakthrough, one match, one clue, one confession could finally bring this closure out, right? The Zodiac may have thrived on mystery, but modern science is slowly stripping away all of those kind of shadows. Now, whilst justice has yet to be served, the tools of today are going to offer something that was once unimaginable, and that's hope. So I think given all of the new technology and everything that we're trying to do, I think it'll definitely be really interesting to see where that's going to take us. I think there was the biggest case which has been solved most recently is definitely the Golden State Killer. Now, that was one that people thought for years that was never going to be solved, and that brought about a lot of justice for a lot of victims. So we never know. The Zodiac Killer is definitely one of the ones that I'm always going to be watching documentaries. I'm always going to be listening to podcasts on. I think it really is fascinating. And whilst I don't want it to be fascinating, because obviously it's a horrible circumstance, it really is one of those, because it hasn't been solved, it's just in the back of your mind, who is this really? So the Golden State Killer. Now, before he had a name, he's known as many different names. He's known as the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker. So for decades, these titles described a faceless predator who terrorized California communities with a string of violent crimes. It wasn't until years later that investigators realized that these were all the same person, the man who would become to known as the Golden State Killer. You guys, you have to go and watch a documentary that, oh my gosh, it's eluding me now. I will add into the comment section, but it's an actor's wife. She played a fairly pivotal role in finding out who this was, but it was a really, really great documentary. It was, it's eluding me, but I'll put it into the comments. So his crimes, they spanned over a decade, beginning in the mid-1970s and continued into the 1980s. He was methodical, he's elusive, and he is truly terrifying. For years, he vanished without a trace, leaving behind shattered lives and unanswered questions. The Golden State Killer's timeline is a chilling journey through. He massively escalated the violence, spanning over a decade, and it left a devastation of bodies across California. It began in 1974 in Visalia, where a series of burglaries started to be reported. These weren't typical break-ins, though. The perpetrator, who's later been dubbed the Visalia Ransacker, he would steal sentimental items. So he'd rearrange belongings, and he'd just leave behind some pretty psychological manipulation. Though no one knew it at the time, this was the beginning of a really dark chapter. By 1976, the crimes have escalated. In Sacramento, there's a new predator who's emerged, known as the East Area Rapist. He targeted women in their homes, often while their partners were actually present. His attacks were calculated. He would stalk his victims for days, break in beforehand to unlock windows. He would hide weapons, and he'd strike at night. He committed over 50 rapes, and often binding his victims and threatening them with death if they moved or made a sound. He would also call them afterwards and further victimize them. He was an absolute disgusting and appalling human being. In 1979, the violence really massively intensified. The killer moved south, and his crimes took on a new level of brutality. He's now known as the original Night Stalker. He began murdering his victims. Couples were attacked in their homes, they're bludgeoned or shot. They're left, and these are scenes of horror. So if I've got videos going on in the background, guys, I just want to warn you, I'll pop it in after this, obviously, these videos. There is some pretty brutal and bloody violence involved in these, and it can get quite graphic. So the murders continue through to 1986. He had victims in Ventura, Orange, and Santa Barbara counties. Then suddenly he vanishes. For years, his crimes were treated as separate cases, but it's not until 2001 until DNA evidence linked the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker. It was confirmed, though, that they were the same person. This revelation redefined the scope of the investigation and gave birth to what we know now today as the Golden State Killer. The timeline of his crimes is not just a list of dates. It's almost like a map of fear. Each attack shattered lives, traumatized communities, and it left behind a lot of unanswered questions. And for decades, the killer remained a phantom, unseen, unknown, and unpunished. He's not just a criminal, though. He was a predator who thrived on control, fear, and psychological torment. He was the embodiment of just terrifying man. What he did to his victims, his surviving victims, was just next level. He would call them and he would threaten them. He knew what they did on a day-to-day basis. He would attack these women while their husbands, their boyfriends, their partners were home, sometimes even when their children were home. He was an absolute vile predator. His MO it's not only brutal though, but it's really, really calculated. He was obsessed with domination and manipulation. As I said before, he's stalking his victims for days and sometimes even weeks. He'd study their routines, he'd learn out the layout of their homes, and sometimes he would break in beforehand and he would leave clues for himself and tools that he would use later when he was ready to commit his crime. This premeditated behavior created a sense of vulnerability long before the actual attack had occurred. But when he struck, and it's almost always at night, he wore a ski mask, dark clothing, and he would blend into those shadows so you couldn't really see him. He would be described by the victims as eerily calm, speaking in a low, whispering voice that made his threats even sound more menacing and terrifying. He used ligatures, which was often shoelaces or cords, to bind his victims, and he'd separate the couples. He would force the male partner to lie down while he would assault the victims. But these men would hear what their partners were going through. And one of the most chilling tactics involved placing dishes or other objects on the male partner's back and threatening to kill them both if he heard the slightest of sounds. This isn't just about physical control, it's psychological warfare on that person, because imagine the fear that you would have. So he created an atmosphere of dread that lingered long after the attacks had ended. He didn't just commit the crimes and flee. In many cases, he lingered, eating food from their kitchen, rummaging through drawers. He'd make phone calls from the victims' landlines. He wanted to leave his mark, and not just physically, but emotionally. He was very territorial. He was almost like, I hate to use this term, he would leave he'd want to piss on them, basically. Survivors would often speak of an eerie silence and the sense that he was watching them after he left. The Golden State Killer also made taunting phone calls to victims and their families, often days and weeks after the attack. These calls were brief, they were cryptic, they're terrifying, but proof that he was still out there watching them, and that's where he had that control factor. His ability to evade capture for decades was partly due to his meticulous planning and partly due to the fragmented nature of law enforcement at this time. But what truly set him apart from other predators at the time was his need to dominate not just his victims, but the entire investigation process. He manipulated fear like a weapon, and for years he wielded it with probably what I would call devastating precision. The investigation into the Golden State Killer was one of the most complex and frustrating manhunts in all of America's criminal history. For over 4 decades, law enforcement agencies chased shadows, they followed dead-end leads, and struggled to connect the dots across a sprawling web of crimes. One of the biggest challenges was the fragmentation of the case. The Golden State Killer, he operated across multiple counties, so Sacramento, Ventura, Orange, and Santa Barbara, each of them having their own police departments and investigation protocols. And in the 1970s and 1980s, there's no centralized database or streamlined communication between these jurisdictions. Now, that's not to say that that's anyone's fault, right? Because it's the times. You don't really understand that. Now, as a result, at the time, critical evidence and patterns were often missed and delayed. Excuse me while I just take a drink. Today we're drinking Schweppes pink lemonade. It's delicious. So these crimes were misattributed at the time. For years, investigators believed that they were dealing with separate offenders. So they believed that the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker were 3 different people. So it's not until 2001 that it links all these cases. So this revelation redefined the scope of the investigation. But it really did. It came decades too late for many victims and families. Despite the DNA link, the killer's identity still remained elusive. Investigators had a genetic profile, but no matches in their criminal databases. So they followed thousands of leads, they interviewed hundreds of suspects, and even consulted psychics. But the trail always went cold. The case gained renewed momentum thanks to a lot of public interest and media coverage. Journalists, bloggers, amateur sleuths began digging into more details, sharing theories and timelines, One of the most influential, and this is the documentary, I knew I'd had it somewhere in here, so it's Michelle McNamara. She's a true crime writer. I'll Be Gone in the Dark. That brought national attention to the case. There's a documentary actually called I'll Be Gone in the Dark. Go and watch it. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever watched. Her meticulous research and passionate advocacy helped reignite the investigation and inspired a whole generation of new detectives. Still, the killer remained hidden. He had stopped attacking in 1986, and for decades there's radio silence. There's no letters, there's no phone calls, there's no sightings. It's as if, again, he vanished into thin air. A bit like the Zodiac, right? But behind the scenes, forensic science was evolving. Investigators held on to DNA evidence. They're waiting for the day when technology might catch up. And it's in 2018 that day finally came. The investigation into the Golden State Killer's testament it's all about persistence, collaboration, and the power of science. It's a story of frustration and heartbreak, but it's also a really good story of hope, because even after years of silence, justice is still possible. After decades of fear and frustration and unanswered questions for the survivors, the case of the Golden State Killer finally reached a turning point thanks to the relentless pursuit of justice and the revolutionary power of forensic science. Now, this is what we're hoping for the Zodiac Killer, right? This is what's going to happen for those surviving victims and those people that hopefully will get some justice for those families of those victims. In the early 2000s, the investigation, they'd already discovered that all these cases are linked. They knew they're hunting one man, but without a match in this, criminal database, it's going cold all over again. He's never been arrested. He's never submitted his DNA. So he's never left behind a name. Then came a new breakthrough that changes everything. This genetic genealogy. In 2018, investigators took a bold step. They uploaded the Golden State's DNA to a public genealogy website, one used by everyday people to trace their ancestry. From there, they found distant relatives and began building a family tree. It was painstaking work. Like, if you ever go watch the documentary, it was insane how much work went into this. It involved thousands of records, birth certificates, and historical data. But eventually, it leads to this name of this Joseph James D'Angelo. D'Angelo is a former police officer. He'd worked in law enforcement during the time of the attacks. He had an understanding of investigation procedures, and that's what helped him evade all the capture. He lived in California. He had access to the areas where the crimes occurred and matched the age and the profile of the suspect. So surveillance teams collected a discarded item, rumoured to be a tissue or some type of rubbish, and tested it against the DNA from the crime scenes. It's a match. So on April 24th in 2018, he's arrested outside of his home in Citrus Heights in California. The man who'd haunted the state for decades, he's finally in custody. In 2020, he pled guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping, admitting he would admit to dozens of rapes and burglaries. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. Should have gotten a hell of a lot worse, but I understand. The arrest of the Golden State Killer, though, was more than just a victory for law enforcement. It was a moment of closure for all those survivors, the families, the communities that had endured this man. People who had lived in fear for years could finally breathe. Those victims that he had called and threatened to kill, they finally, I imagine, could actually sleep at night. And fortunately, for the ones who had actually lost some loved ones, they could begin to heal. This case proved that justice delayed is not always justice denied. It showed that science, persistence, and innovation can overcome even the darkest of mysteries. And it's opened up the door for solving cold cases using the same techniques. The Golden State Killer thought he could outrun time, but in the end, it's science that actually caught up with him. Now, today, we've journeyed through some of the most haunting cold cases in history, the cryptic terror of the Zodiac Killer, and the long-awaited justice in the case of the Golden State Killer. Each story is a reminder that behind every headline is a human life and a family shattered, a community that is shaken, and a legacy of unanswered questions. These aren't just cases that are puzzles for investigators. They're deeply personal tragedies that continue to echo through the sands of time. But there's something remarkable that's happening in the background, guys. With every advancement in forensic science, every breakthrough in technology, it brings us closer to understanding and also determining who these killers are. And hopefully, with further advancements in DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, digital decoding, these tools are certainly giving a lot of life into some fairly old cases. And I really, really do. My biggest hope is that people and victims and families of the Zodiac Killer will have justice one day. Justice, it's going to be slow and it may be elusive, but it's not always impossible. And as I close out my episode, let's just remember the victims, not just as names in a case file, not just as people's whose stories deserve to be told, but their lives are the ones who matter, and it's memories that fuel the pursuit of time. Thank you for joining me for my episode of Crimes from the Peanut Gallery. If you find today's episode awesome and compelling, please share it with your fellow peanuts. Subscribe, hit that like button, leave a comment if you want to. Your support helps me with all of my stories and the conversations to keep going. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop asking questions, and explore all of my other episodes. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, my fellow peanuts. Bye.